The Gigabyte Z590 Aorus Pro AX is one of the latest additions to Gigabyte's gaming motherboard lineup, with the Pro moniker denoting its mainstream position in the Aorus motherboard stack. For those who want a more premium motherboard, they can look towards the Aorus Master and Aorus Extreme boards, while for those who want a slightly more affordable option, there's also the Aorus Elite boards too. But I'm probably getting distracted from the main topic. I'm Vincent Chan from Podder.net, and let's check out the Z590 Aorus Pro AX. For anyone who has seen a recent Aorus motherboard, the packaging here is very similar. A big Aorus emblem and the naming is prominently displayed on the front side. There's also a new Intel Core logo and the Intel Z590 logo to indicate its support for the 12th Gen Intel Core processors. Over on the back, there's the specifications and highlighted features. As you open the box, the first thing you will see is the motherboard. Lifting it out reveals the user manual, an App Center user guide, and an installation guide. To the right of the documentation stack comes an array of cables like the RGB LED extension cable, SATA cables, 2 thermistors for hardware temperature sensing, and some screws. Over to the left, we have the G connector for quickly attaching your fiddly case connectors and the Wi-Fi antenna. Now, it's time to check out the board. From an aesthetics point of view, the Z590 Aorus Pro AX is virtually identical to the Z490 Aorus Pro AX. You get the same fin array heatsink over the VRMs, which is definitely a nice change from the aluminium chunks that the competition often apply on their VRMs. Of course, this being a relatively premium board, it also sports an I/O shroud to hide away the ugly connectors. The shroud also extends over the audio circuitry with a touch of bling in the form of the M.2 audio text that will glow in RGB. There's also some yellow capacitors visible down here. Along the top of the board, we can see the 4+8 pin EPS power connectors and the second VRM heatsink, which is a solid aluminium chunk. There's a heat pipe running underneath though, so there shouldn't be any issues here as the fin stack should be more than capable of wicking away heat from both the VRM arrays. It's quite interesting that Gigabyte decided to label their board around the socket. It looks pretty military inspired with the diagonal lines, and I do think for those who want a minimalist build, having it near the socket means that you can essentially not see it if you slap on a huge air cooler. The RAM slots here are also reinforced, which should prevent you from being able to rip out the memory slots by pulling on them without the clips undone first. I have not done it personally, but apparently it has happened to some people. Overall, there's little to differentiate the Z590 Aorus Pro AX from its predecessor. The main difference would probably be the additional heat spreader over the PCIe for M.2 slot. The placement of the SATA slot and a few headers have also been moved around, but nothing too spectacular. All the features are still seemingly available here. Now, let's get into the highlight of the board, the VRM. Gigabyte has not disappointed us when it comes to the VRM recently, usually designing their Aorus motherboards with an overkill VRM system. However, as we have previously noted, going overkill in this area does allow for the VRM to run more efficiently, as they will be closer to the peak of their efficiency curve when under full load. That in turn translates to lower operating temperatures, which will then result in a longer service life. The Z590 Aorus Pro AX power delivery system comprises of a direct 12-phase design, with 90 smart power stages for each V-core phase. This is then fed through the chokes and into the tantalum polymer capacitors array, which will improve transient response. The PWM controller is none other than the ISL 69269 from Intersil, while the power stages are the ISL 99390 that are featured in the last gen really high-end boards. There are no doublers nor team power stages here, so the transient response should be as good as it can be. The iGPU gets a single phase, which is what you would expect from a board like this. Gigabyte definitely doesn't expect you to use the Z590 Aorus Pro X without a dedicated GPU, and neither do we. Let's also talk about the heatsinks. The aluminium chunk above the socket sports some Japanese writing which we have yet to decipher until today. Hopefully you guys can help us do it because we can't read Japanese. Taking it off the motherboard, we can see that the block above the socket is connected to the fin array via a rather thick heat pipe. Gigabyte designed the VRM cooling to have a direct touch heat pipe, which means that the heat pipes are what's directly contacting the VRM to more efficiently spread the heat out between the two cooling blocks. Pretty nifty, but we will have to see how well they work when handling the 11th gen processors. Moving on, check out these reinforced RAM slots. By default, the official support is for up to 2933 MHz on 10th gen and up to 3200 MHz on 11th gen. Gigabyte claims of support for up to 5400 MHz overclocks with the 11th gen processors, But of course, that will depend heavily on your memory modules and also the IMC in your processor. The motherboard's job is to ensure that the voltage delivery and signaling is as clean as it can be to prevent jeopardizing your OCE efforts. There's no ECC here, but it can support up to 32GB DIMMs for a maximum of 128GB of RAM. As mentioned earlier, all the slots are reinforced to prevent them from being damaged when you remove your memory. Another part of the motherboard that also sports reinforcement are the PCIe slots. If the Z590 Aorus Pro AX is used with an 11th gen processor, you get PCIe 4.0 support, while if you use it with a 10th gen processor, you can only go up to PCIe 3. There are a total of 3 full-length PCIe slots on the motherboard, with only the first one being reinforced. This is where you should put your main GPU. Meanwhile, the second and third slots only offer 4 PCIe 3 lanes each from the Intel Z590 chipset, which means you won't be able to run SLI on this board. Speaking of the PCIe configuration, the Z590 Aorus Pro AX has a really unique way of splitting the PCIe lanes. Instead of splitting the PCIe lanes from the CPU between the PCIe X16 slots for multi-GPU configurations, the Z590 Aorus Pro AX offers support for 3 M.2 PCIe 4x4 SSDs. It does this by splitting the 16 lanes that are usually reserved for the GPU to the second and third M.2 slot. This is a very interesting configuration, as now the main GPU only runs with PCIe 4x8 bandwidth. Gigabyte first introduced this layout with the B550 Master, so I guess you can say that the technology from the higher end boards are indeed trickling down the product stack. While I do believe that it shouldn't bottleneck your GPU by much, I'm not exactly sure how many people actually need that many M.2 PCIe 4 SSDs in the first place, especially if they're getting a board like the Z590 Aorus Pro AX. If you want to use 2 M.2 SSDs without sacrificing the GPU's bandwidth, you can use the last M.2 slot, which is handled by the Z590 chipset. It can use the PCIe 3.0 X4 or SATA interface, the latter which the other 3 M.2 slots cannot do. All the M.2 slots sport thermal pads on the underside to better conduct heat to the heat spreader. The heat spreader that mounts onto the SSD from the top also sports a generous application of thermal pads. In fact, Gigabyte went as far as to apply higher quality ones for the first 3 M.2 slots to afford better cooling to the PCIe 4 SSDs that are known to run rather toasty. There are also 6 SATA ports here in case you want to settle for older storage formats. Luckily, all are nice right-angled ones, so cable management should be a breeze. One of the SATA ports will be disabled if you decide to use the M.2 SATA SSD in the lowest M.2 slot though, so make sure to keep an eye out for that. The audio is an area that the Z590 Aorus Pro AX sees a rather huge upgrade over the Z490 Aorus Pro AX. The Z590 Aorus Pro AX now comes with the new Realtek ALC 4080 codec that supports 32-bit 384kHz audio. It is high-res audio certified too, to ensure that you get some really high fidelity audio with the onboard audio alone. The audio portion of the motherboard is also partitioned off from the rest of the board, avoiding interference from messing up your sound. As you might have probably expected from the name, the Z590 Aorus Pro AX comes with the Intel Wi-Fi 6 AX200 network adapter. This allows for up to 2.4 gigabit per second Wi-Fi and also Bluetooth 5.1, which are pretty much standard features of better gaming motherboards out there. It isn't the latest, as Intel does offer the Wi-Fi 6 AX210 for 6GHz Wi-Fi 2, but I guess Wi-Fi 6 is plenty for most gamers who might have yet to upgrade to a Wi-Fi 6 router in the first place. If you prefer a wired connection, there's also the Intel 2.5GB Ethernet LAN. Since we're on the topic of connectivity, for USB, there are 4 USB 3.2 Gen 2 10GB per second Type A ports, 1 USB 3.2 Gen 2 X2 20GB per second Type C port, and 4 USB 3.0 Type A ports. You also get 4 older USB 2.0 ports for your peripherals that don't need the higher speeds, to bring the total to a whopping 12 USB-A ports. If for some reason you need to use the iGPU, there's a single DisplayPort output. We also think that it is worth highlighting the USB Type-C header that supports up to USB 3.2 Gen 2 speeds for convenient access to a fast USB-C port on your front panel. In conclusion, the Z590 Aorus Pro AX is a pretty interesting offering from Gigabyte, especially if you plan on having multiple M.2 PCIe 4 SSDs. Support for a total of 4 M.2 PCIe SSDs is definitely not a common feature in this price range. Speaking of which, the motherboard retails for around RM1439, so you can definitely check it out if you are a storage hoarder and one who really likes their fast storage. And that's it for our overview of the Z590 Aorus Pro AX. What do you think of splitting off the GPU's 16 lanes to allow for 2 additional M.2 PCIe 4 SSDs? Is it something you don't mind, or do you want your GPU to get the full 16 lanes regardless? Let us know. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give us a thumbs up. We'll also be doing a full review of the motherboard, so stay tuned for that. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, like our Facebook page, and follow us on Instagram for more content like this. I'm Vincent Chan from Portal.net, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye bye!